The traveling salesman said the cruel word at 10 in the morning of Saturday the 8th of May, 1880, at the front counter of the Pratt dry goods store in Bear Hollow, Montana Territory, in front of 7 other women, and the whole small, careful room went so still that the small clay bell over the door was heard swinging in the last of the wind that had come in behind the last customer. The salesman was a man named Julius Carver. Julius Carver was 36 years old, thin as a piece of split kindling, dressed in a small, careful black suit that had been pressed at the small, careful Helena Hotel the night before, and carrying a small, careful brown leather case at his own careful feet. Julius Carver had ridden into Bear Hollow the day before on the small, careful 11 o'clock stage. Julius Carver was on his own careful sales route through the small, careful frontier towns of the Bitterroot Valley to sell a small, careful new product from a small, careful Boston medicine company. The product was called Dr. Whitaker's Reducing Salts. The product was, by every careful account of any small, careful chemist in Boston, made of nothing but common baking soda, powdered chalk, and a small, careful drop of blue food coloring to make the water in the glass turn the small, careful pale blue of a cool, careful morning. Julius Carver had been at Edmund Pratt's counter for the last 35 minutes, selling the small, careful blue tins to the 7 small, careful women who had come into the store that Saturday morning. 3 of the women had bought a tin, 4 had not. Julius Carver had a small, careful patter for each of the 4. The patter was small. The patter was practiced. The patter was cruel in the way small practiced sales patter can be cruel to a woman who has been told by a well-dressed stranger in a small, careful hotel-pressed suit that her own body is a small, careful project that could stand a small, careful improvement. The small, careful clay bell over the front door rang at 10, and Clementine Boone walked in. The whole store turned. Clem was 35 years old that spring. Clem was 5 foot 9 inches tall. Clem was a size 24 in her prairie dresses. Clem was, by the small, careful arithmetic of any tape measure that had ever been laid across her broad shoulders, the biggest woman in Bear Hollow, Montana. She stood a full inch taller than Edmund Pratt at his own careful counter. She weighed, by her own careful count at the small, careful scale in the back of the boarding kitchen, 240 pounds. She wore, that Saturday morning, the wine-red prairie dress she had been wearing at the Pratt boarding kitchen for the last 2 years, the clean white cotton apron tied at the small of her broad back in the small, careful long bow, and a grey wool shawl over her wide shoulders because the spring wind had come off the high-pass cold. Her dark hair was in the low, careful knot at the nape of her neck. Her wedding band from Daniel Boone was on the 3rd finger of her left hand, where it had been since 1872. She had come in for the small, careful weekly order for the Pratt boarding kitchen. A 20-pound sack of flour, 10 pounds of salt pork, a small clay jar of dried mustard, a small canvas sack of yellow onions. The small, careful order that Sarah Pratt had written down on the back of the small, careful boarding kitchen ledger at 4 in the morning. She had a small, careful pencil-written note in her own big hand, in her own careful apron pocket. Julius Carver saw her. Julius Carver did not. By his own careful arithmetic of his own careful 36 years, know Clementine Boone. Julius Carver was a stranger in this small, careful town. Julius Carver did not know that Clementine Boone had been the head cook of the Pratt boarding kitchen for the last 7 years. That she had caught 71 babies at the North Settlement Road and the Upper Creek in those 7 years. That she had been widowed at 34 when a runaway team of 6 mules had killed her freighter husband Daniel in the spring of the year before. Or that she had, at that very careful moment, a small, careful mountain man of 42 years named Jed Stark, sitting at the small back kitchen table of the Pratt boarding kitchen every Friday evening for the last 6 months for the small 40-cent boarder's supper. Julius Carver saw a woman his own careful eye had been trained by his own careful Boston medicine company to see as a small, careful walking sales opportunity. Julius Carver did not lower his voice. Julius Carver raised it. "Well," Julius Carver said, in a voice the whole store heard on purpose. This is the very customer Dr. Whitaker's reducing salts were formulated for. Ladies, observe, the lady would benefit greatly. A course of the salts, taken faithful, 3 times a day for a period of 6 months, would take the lady from her current dimensions down to something a man in this territory might, by the small careful arithmetic of any small careful mirror, want to marry. The store did not breathe for one long careful second. Behind the counter, Edmund Pratt, 61 years old, went the color of a small careful old sheet of paper. Edmund Pratt set his small pencil down on the small careful ledger. Edmund Pratt began to open his own careful mouth. Edmund Pratt did not, in the next 5 seconds, get the words out, because before Edmund Pratt got past the first small careful breath, Mrs. Camilla Bunting, the wife of the smithy Jacob Bender, and by every careful account of Bear Hollow the town's leading whisper, laughed. It was not a full laugh. It was the small, careful half-breath of a woman who had, in her own careful kitchen, thought the same small, careful, cruel thought about Clem more than once, and who had, for one small, careful second, allowed a stranger to say it in front of her. Then the store went silent again. Clem did not move. Clem did not set her order down. Clem did not turn her head to Camilla Bunting. Clem did not blink at Julius Carver. Clem stood at the doorway of the Pratt dry goods store, with her broad shoulders held straight and her wide, steady stance planted in her own careful boots, and her big, kind face held so still it might have been carved out of a small, careful piece of pale birch. Clem had been called big since she was 12 years old. Clem had been called too big to love since she was 17. Clem had, in 23 years of hearing the word out loud in one small, careful frontier kitchen or another, learned to do exactly one thing when the word was said. She had learned to outwait it. She had learned to wait the room out until the room said the next word first. The next word was almost always an apology. The apology was almost never good enough. But the apology was, by Clem's own careful count, the small, careful proof that the room had run out of the small, careful, cruel words first. Julius Carver, being a stranger in Bear Hollow, did not know the outweight. Julius Carver had lost, in the first 10 careful seconds of the silence, the small, careful advantage his own well-pressed suit had given him at the counter. Julius Carver, being a salesman, tried to recover the small, careful advantage by talking. Now, ma'am, I do not of course mean the smallest careful offense. I only observe, as any careful physician of the Boston school would, that the lady's dimensions have crossed a certain small, careful threshold, beyond which the small, careful state of matrimony becomes, for statistical reasons, a small, careful impossibility. This is not, in any way, a personal remark. This is a small, careful medical fact. Ladies, may I demonstrate the salts? A small, careful tin is $2.40. 2 full months of dosage. The small, careful clay bell over the front door of the Pratt dry goods store rang for the second time in 1 minute. Every head in the store turned. The tall, quiet mountain man had walked in. Jed Stark, of the high North Ridge above Bear Hollow, of 42 years. Of the fur-lined buckskin coat and the brown wool felt hat, with the slight curl and the small, careful gray-blue eyes, that had not, in 9 winters, been in Edmund Pratt's dry goods store more than twice a year, stood in the doorway of the store at 5 minutes past 10 on that Saturday morning in May, with his own careful hat in his own careful left hand, and a small careful list of the small careful spring nails he had come down to buy in his own careful right. Jed did not, for 2 full careful seconds, move. Jed had heard the last part of Julius Carver's careful sales pitch through the small, careful open window at the back of the small dry goods store, as he had walked past on the small, careful wooden walk from where he had tied the bay mare at the smithy's rail. Jed had heard the word marry. Jed had heard the word ladies. Jed had heard the small, careful giggle that had been Camilla Bunting's half-breath at the counter. Jed had, in the small, careful 3 seconds it took him to come around to the front door and set his own hand on the brass knob, put together in his own careful head what Julius Carver had just said, and to whom, and in front of whom. Jed walked in the same small, careful, slow walk he had walked into Clem's own front room on the 18th of November of 1879, when he had come down off the ridge in the snow to ask her to come up and feed his own dying friend, old Tom Brennan. He walked slow. He walked without any small, careful drama. He walked past the small, careful clay bell and past the small, careful barrel of pickled cabbage at the front, and past the small, careful ladder to the top shelf, and past the 7 other women who had all turned to look at him. He walked to the small, careful space at the front counter where Julius Carver was standing with a small, careful blue tin of Dr. Whittaker's reducing salts held up in his small, careful, thin hand. Jed stopped one careful step behind Clem's own broad shoulder. He did not touch her. He set his hat, careful, on the small, careful counter to Julius Carver's left. He set his own careful list of the small, careful spring nails on the counter beside the hat. He turned. He faced Julius Carver. Julius Carver was 5'7" tall. Julius Carver was, at that small, careful moment, looking up at a man of 6'2" in a fur-lined buckskin coat and a brown wool felt hat, with a small, careful line of gray at the beard and the small, careful gray-blue eyes of a Union sharpshooter scout from the Army of the Potomac, who had, at Gettysburg on the 2nd of July of 1863, taken a small, careful piece of grape shot to his own left shoulder, and had not, in the 17 years since, taken a single small, careful piece of nonsense from any small, careful, thin salesman in any small, careful pressed suit in any small, careful frontier dry goods store. Jed did not raise his voice. Jed did not in any small, careful count of the room need to. "Sir, your name." "Julius Carver, sir, of the Whittaker Boston Medical Company, traveling representative for the small, careful territory of Montana. I am, sir, on my careful sales route. Might I offer you a small, careful tin of Dr. Whittaker's?" "You might not, Mr. Carver." The store was very quiet. Jed set his own big, careful right hand on the counter. Jed did not curl the hand into a fist. Jed spread the small, careful fingers wide on the pine wood of the counter, the way a big, careful man spreads a small, careful hand when he wants a small, careful, thin man across from him to see the small, careful size of it. "Mr. Carver, you have said one small, careful sentence in this store this morning about the lady standing at my own careful shoulder. I heard it through the open window. I heard the small, careful giggle that came after it. You will now, Mr. Carver, do 3 small, careful things in the next 2 minutes. You will apologize to the lady. You will apologize to Mr. Pratt at the counter for using the small, careful store as the small, careful room for your remark. You will pack up your small, careful blue tins into your small, careful brown leather case at your feet. You will then walk out this small, careful door. You will get on the small, careful noon stage back to Helena. You will not come back to Bear Hollow, Montana, in any month of any year of the small, careful rest of your life. If you do come back, Mr. Carver, I will hear about it. I will ride down. I will not, on that small, careful day, be as polite as I am this Saturday morning. Are we in a small, careful understanding, Mr. Carver?" Julius Carver, thin as a piece of split kindling in his small, careful hotel pressed black suit, looked up at Jed Stark for one long, careful second. Julius Carver did the small, careful arithmetic in his own careful head. Julius Carver had done the same small, careful arithmetic before in 3 other small, careful frontier towns, and had, by his own careful count, always chosen the same small, careful answer. Julius Carver bowed. Julius Carver bowed to Clem first, then he bowed to Edmund Pratt. Then he packed his small, careful blue tins into his small, careful brown leather case at his feet. His small, careful thin hands were shaking. 2 of the tins fell out and rolled under the counter. Julius Carver did not stop to pick them up. Julius Carver picked up his small, careful brown leather case, put on his small, careful bowler hat, and walked out of the Pratt dry goods store at the small, careful count of 8 minutes past 10 in the morning. The small clay bell over the door rang once behind him. Julius Carver did, by every small, careful account of the Bear Hollow stage register, take the noon stage back to Helena that Saturday. Julius Carver did not, in the 22 careful years of his own careful life that remained to him, set foot in Bear Hollow, Montana territory. Again. Inside the small, careful dry goods store, at 10:10 on the same Saturday morning, Jed Stark did not turn to look at Clem. Jed set his small, careful hat, careful, back on his own careful head. Jed picked up his small, careful list of the small, careful spring nails. Jed spoke, low, to Edmund Pratt at the counter, in the careful, small, polite voice he had used at the same counter twice a year for 6 years. Edmund, 12 pounds of the small, careful spring nails, 6-inch, cut. I will settle the account today. Edmund Pratt, still the color of an old sheet of paper, said, Yes, Mr. Stark. The 7 women in the store did not, for the next long, careful second, breathe. Then Clem, who had not moved once in the last 4 minutes, set her own small pencil-written note on the counter beside Jed's own careful list of spring nails. Edmund, 20 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of salt pork, a small clay jar of dried mustard, yellow onions from the small, careful third bin at the back. Edmund Pratt began to write. The 7 other women in the store looked at Camilla Bunting. Camilla Bunting looked at the small, careful floor. Clem and Jed walked out of the Pratt dry goods store together at 10 that Saturday morning. Clem carried the small canvas sack of dried mustard and the small canvas sack of yellow onions in her own big, careful hands. Jed carried the small canvas sack of 12 pounds of 6-inch cut spring nails on his own careful left shoulder and the 20-pound sack of flour on his own careful right shoulder. Edmund Pratt had said the salt pork would be sent over to the boarding kitchen by his own careful stable boy at noon. They walked, slow and careful, the 4 blocks south on Main Street of Bear Hollow. They did not talk for the first 2 blocks. Main Street was Saturday morning quiet. The freight wagons at Hiram Foley's depot were standing in the mud of the last spring rain. The small, careful smithy fire at Jacob Bender's was going. The bay mare was at the smithy's rail, where Jed had tied her at 10:10. At the corner of Main Street and the small, careful east road that ran back to the town cabin at the south end, Jed stopped. He set the 20-pound sack of flour, careful, down on the small wooden walk. He set the small canvas sack of nails, careful, down beside it. Clem, Jed, Clem. I would say one small, careful sentence to you now. I would say it once. I would say it now because if I do not say it in this small, careful 5 minutes, I will not have the small, careful courage to say it for the next month of Fridays. She looked at him. She did not, that morning, cry. Big women, who have been called too big to love since the age of 17, do not cry on the small, careful wooden walk of Main Street at 10:30 in the morning of a Saturday in May. They stand steady. They wait. They hold the small canvas sack of dried mustard in their own big, careful hands. They keep breathing. That was what Clem did. Jed did not, at that small, careful corner, look away. Clem. What Mr. Carver said in the store was the smallest, careful, cruelest thing I have heard said in Bear Hollow, Montana, in the last 9 winters of my life on the North Ridge. What Mr. Carver said was a small, careful lie. There is not a small, careful man in this territory whose careful arithmetic of the small, careful state of matrimony has any careful room for what Mr. Carver said. My own careful arithmetic does not. I have not, Clem Boone, said a small, careful word to you in the last 6 months about the state of matrimony. I have sat at the small back kitchen table of the Pratt boarding kitchen on 26 Fridays. I have not said one small, careful sentence about it. I will say 2 now. The first sentence is that Mr. Carver was wrong. The second sentence is that I would, in the small, careful next month, or in the small, careful next year, or on the small, careful day you would name, sit at the small back kitchen table for a 53rd Friday supper and say to you the small, careful thing Mr. Carver said was impossible. I would say it plainly. I would say it slow. I am, Clem Boone, only telling you today so you know that Mr. Carver was wrong. You will name the small, careful Friday. I will wait. I have waited 9 winters. I can wait 1 more. Clem stood on the small, careful wooden walk of Main Street of Bear Hollow, Montana Territory, at 26 minutes past 10 in the morning of the 8th of May of 1880, with her own big, careful arms full of dried mustard and yellow onions, and she did not, for one full, long, careful second, breathe. Then she said, very low, "Jed Stark." "Yes, Clem." "Jed, I heard you." "Clem." "Yes. You will tell me when." She nodded, slow. She did not, at that small, careful morning corner of Main Street, name the Friday. She had, by her own careful arithmetic, no small, careful right to name it in the 5 minutes after a small, careful stranger had called her too big to love in a small, careful dry goods store. Big women who have been called that word do not, by their own careful count, make small, careful decisions about the state of matrimony inside the same small, careful hour the word was said. Big women wait. They wait until the word has stopped ringing in their own careful ears. Jed knew. Jed set his own careful right hand, gentle, on the small, careful edge of the 20-pound sack of flour. Jed said, low, "Clem, I will hear you name it when you are ready. I will be at the small back kitchen table this Friday. I will be at the small back kitchen table every Friday. I will not, in any of those Fridays, ask you again. You will tell me." Clem said, low, "Jed, I will tell you." Jed picked up the 20-pound sack of flour on his own careful right shoulder. Jed picked up the small canvas sack of nails on his own careful left shoulder. They walked the last 2 blocks in the small, careful, comfortable silence of 2 people who had, by the small, careful arithmetic of one Saturday morning in a dry goods store, settled a small, careful thing between them. At the front gate of the town cabin at the south end of Main Street, Amos Miller, 5 years old, was on the small, careful porch with a small, careful wooden horse in his own careful, small hand. Amos looked up. Amos was a small, quiet, blond boy with pale blue eyes. Amos had been Clem's own son by adoption since the autumn of 1878, when he had been 3, and both his own Swedish parents, Hans and Astrid Miller, had died in the small, careful typhoid on the North Settlement Road in 9 hot September days. Amos did not talk much. When Amos did talk, it was by every careful account of any grown adult who had ever sat across from him at a small, careful kitchen table, worth the small, careful listen. "Mama." "Yes, sweetness." "Mama, Mr. Stark is with you." "Yes, sweetness." "Mama, Mr. Stark has come to the front gate for the first time in 2 Saturdays." "Yes, sweetness." Amos looked at Jed. Jed looked at Amos. Amos said, very quiet, "Mr. Stark, would you sit at Mama's kitchen table for a small, careful cup of coffee before you ride back up the ridge?" Jed set the 20-pound sack of flour down on the small, careful porch step. Jed set the small canvas sack of nails down beside it. Jed took his small, careful hat off. Jed knelt down on his own careful right knee at the small, careful porch step, so his own big, careful eyes were at Amos's own small, careful eye level. "Amos Miller." "Mr. Stark." "Amos, I would sit at your mama's kitchen table for a small, careful cup of coffee. I would, by my own count, be glad to." Amos nodded, slow and steady. Amos went inside to pull down the small, careful 3rd tin cup from the high shelf. Clem, at the front gate, watched her own big, careful son of 5 walk into her own small, careful kitchen. She said, very low, to no one but the small, careful spring morning above her own careful head, one careful sentence in her own steady voice, "Wait, there is a Friday coming." She did not, on that small, careful Saturday, name the Friday. But she had, by the small, careful arithmetic of the small, careful walk home, decided which one it was going to be. Clementine Boone had been a big girl since her 7th birthday. She had been born in the small, careful farmhouse of her own careful father, Silas Boone, a Quaker schoolmaster of Greene County, Tennessee, in the spring of 1845. Her mother had been Sarah Boone, born Sarah Mackenzie, of the small, careful Highland Scottish community that had come to the small, careful hills of eastern Tennessee in the years before the small, careful war. Sarah Mackenzie Boone had been 6 foot even. Sarah had been a big woman all her life. Sarah's own mother back in the Highlands had been 6 foot 2. Clem had come, on her mother's side, from 4 small, careful generations of Scottish women, who had been the tallest careful women in every small, careful village they had ever lived in. Sarah Boone had taught her only daughter Clem 2 things, side by side, from Clem's 4th careful birthday. Sarah had taught her the kitchen. Sarah had taught her the small, careful herbs of the Highland tradition. The kitchen came first. The herbs came second. Clem could fry a perfect small, careful cornbread by age 8. Clem could keep a small, careful Quaker household table for 11 people by age 11. Clem could name every small, careful herb in the small, careful woods behind the farmhouse by age 12. Clem could catch a small, careful baby by age 15, because her own mother had brought her to the small, careful bedside of the neighbor Rebecca Ellsworth's 3rd small, careful boy in the spring of 1860, and had, by the small, careful count of Sarah's own careful hand, at Clem's own back, let her do it. By 14, Clem was 5'8". By 15, she was 5'9". By 17, she was 5'9" and 170 pounds. Clem was, by the small, careful arithmetic of every small, careful farm boy of the small, careful eastern Tennessee Valley, one of the 2 tallest careful girls in the whole valley. She was not, by that small, careful arithmetic, a small, careful girl any of the small, careful farm boys had asked to dance at the small, careful barn socials of her 17th summer. Clem had, by her 17th summer, heard the phrase "too big to love" out loud 3 separate careful times. The first careful time was at a small, careful barn social outside Greenville in the small, careful August of 1862, when a small, careful visiting boy from Knoxville named Ephraim Leitner had said it, thinking Clem was in the next small, careful room. The second careful time was at a small, careful church picnic in the small, careful June of 1863, when the same Ephraim Leitner had said it a second time out loud in the small, careful hearing of Clem's own mother, Sarah. The third careful time was at a small, careful funeral for Sarah herself in the small, careful autumn of 1864, when Sarah had died of a small, careful pneumonia, and the same small, careful visiting Ephraim Leitner had said the small, careful sentence for the 3rd time in Clem's own small, careful hearing at the small, careful graveside, and Clem had, at 19 years old, walked over to Ephraim Leitner and had, by the small, careful arithmetic of her own big, careful right hand, slapped him across the small, careful face, hard enough that he had spent the rest of the small, careful afternoon with a small, careful red mark, from his own small, careful ear to his own small, careful chin. Ephraim Leitner had not, by the small, careful reading of Clem's own careful memory, said the sentence a 4th time. Clem had left Greene County, Tennessee, in the small, careful spring of 1868, with her own small, careful trunk, and her own careful cast-iron skillet, and her own careful small clay crock of Sarah's own careful sourdough starter, which had been alive since 1858. Clem had ridden west with her own small, careful older brother, Isaac Boone, who had been a small, careful surveyor for the small, careful new Union Pacific rail extension out of Omaha. Clem had cooked at the small, careful railroad camps of the small, careful Union Pacific from 1868 through 1871. Clem had, in those 3 small, careful years, been paid twice the wage of any of the other small, careful cooks the railroad had ever hired, because Clem could feed a small, careful crew of 80 men on the small, careful 8-day walking march at a small, careful cook fire outside a small, careful tent, with the same small, careful, patient, warm quality of small, careful cornbread and small, careful pork stew every night of every 8-day march. In the small, careful spring of 1871, Clem had met Daniel Boone at a small, careful camp outside the small, careful town of Kearney, Nebraska. Daniel Boone had been 30. Daniel had been a small, careful freighter for the small, careful railroad supply line. Daniel had been a slow, small, careful, kind man, of 6 foot even, with a small, careful, gentle laugh, and the small, careful habit of folding the small, careful corners of his letters into small, careful triangles. Daniel had, on the small, careful 3rd night of the small, careful camp, sat across the small, careful cook fire from Clem, and had said the small, careful sentence Clem had waited 26 years to hear at any small, careful cook fire from any small, careful man of 30. Daniel had said, low, "Miss Boone, you are the finest cook and the biggest, kindest woman on this small, careful stretch of the small, careful railroad line. I would, by my own careful arithmetic, be honored to sit at your kitchen table for the small, careful rest of the life I have left." Clem had said yes. Daniel and Clem had married in the small, careful Methodist chapel of Kearney, Nebraska, on the small, careful 6th of September of 1871. Daniel had taken a small, careful new freight route to Bear Hollow, Montana Territory in the summer of 1873. Clem had come with him. They had built the small, careful town cabin at the south end of Main Street with their own hands in the small, careful autumn of 1873. Clem had begun at the Pratt boarding kitchen on the small, careful 15th of October of 1873. Daniel had begun at the small, careful Bear Hollow freight yard on the same small, careful morning. Daniel had lived at the small, careful Bear Hollow freight yard until the small, careful morning of the 21st of April of 1879, when a small, careful runaway team of 6 mules had turned a loaded wagon over on his own careful 39th year of life. Clem had been 34. Clem had been Daniel's widow for 1 careful year and 17 careful days by the small, careful Saturday morning at the Pratt dry goods store when Julius Carver had said the small, careful sentence at the front counter. Julius Carver had said it wrong. Ephraim Leitner had said it wrong in Tennessee in 1862. Camilla Bunting had, by her own small, careful half-breath at the counter, agreed with them both. Jed Stark had said the small, careful sentence right. Clem had heard it right for the first small, careful time in her 35 careful years of life. The small, careful Friday she was going to name was the small, careful Friday after next. Jedediah Stark had not, in his own careful 42 years, ever said the small, careful word love out loud to any woman. He had thought it 3 times. Once at the age of 19 at a small, careful barn dance in Lawrence County, Pennsylvania, in the small, careful summer of 1857, when he had watched a small, careful, red-haired schoolmaster's daughter named Ruth Elwood dance the small, careful reel with his own small, careful older brother, Ephraim Stark. Once at the age of 22 in the small, careful spring of 1860, when he had walked with the same small, careful Ruth Elwood along the small, careful North Creek path outside the town of New Wilmington, and had, by the small, careful arithmetic of the small, careful 3-hour walk, understood that he wanted to marry her. Once at the age of 23 in the small, careful spring of 1861, when he had asked his own careful mother, Rebecca Stark's small, careful ring off her own careful finger at the small, careful farmhouse kitchen table, and Rebecca had given it to him, and Jed had ridden out that small, careful afternoon to the Elwood farm, and Jed had, at the small, careful front porch of Silas Elwood's own small, careful house, put the small, careful question to Ruth, and Ruth had said yes. Jed had enlisted in the small, careful Union Army 4 weeks later, at the age of 23, in the small, careful June of 1861. Jed had ridden east to Harrisburg. Jed had been sworn into the small, careful Army of the Potomac. Jed had served 4 small, careful years as a small, careful sharpshooter scout. Jed had been at First Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, and the small, careful surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on the 9th of April of 1865. Jed had taken the small, careful piece of grape shot in the left shoulder at Gettysburg. Jed had, by the small, careful arithmetic of his own careful war, written 37 letters to Ruth Elwood in those 4 small, careful years. Ruth had written 13 back. Jed had come home to the small, careful farmhouse outside New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, on the small, careful 8th of May of 1865. Jed had, on the small, careful 9th of May, ridden the small, careful 3 miles to the Elwood farm. Jed had, at the small, careful front porch of Silas Elwood's small, careful house, been told by Silas Elwood that Ruth had married a small, careful lawyer named Edwin Halloran of Philadelphia in the small, careful January of 1864. Ruth had, by Silas's own careful account, sent a small, careful letter to Jed in the small, careful field post in the small, careful January of 1864, telling him. The letter had not, by the small, careful arithmetic of the small, careful field post, reached him. Ruth had a small, careful son named Frederick Halloran, born in the small, careful April of 1865. Jed had not, by his own careful account, blamed Ruth. Jed had not, by his own careful account, blamed the small, careful lawyer, Edwin Halloran, either. Jed had ridden back to his own careful mother Rebecca's small, careful farmhouse. Jed had set his own careful mother's small, careful ring, careful, back on his own careful mother's own careful finger at the small, careful kitchen table. Rebecca had not said anything. Rebecca had put her own small, careful hand on her son's own careful back. Jed had lived one more year at the small, careful Stark farm. Jed had helped his own careful father with the small, careful spring plowing of 1866. Jed had helped his own careful mother with the small, careful summer canning of the same year. Jed had, by the small, careful autumn of 1866, decided he could not, by his own careful arithmetic, live one more careful winter in Lawrence County, Pennsylvania. Jed had ridden west in the spring of 1867. Jed had worked as a small, careful freighter out of St. Joseph, Missouri, for 2 years. Jed had worked as a small, careful railroad surveyor for the small, careful Kansas Pacific for 3. Jed had worked as a small, careful hunter and trapper in the small, careful Bighorn country of Wyoming for 6. Jed had, in the small, careful autumn of 1874, ridden into the small, careful Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory, and had, on a small, careful flat clearing, 8 miles up the north ridge of Bear Hollow, built the small, careful 2-room cedar log cabin that had been his own careful home for the last 6 winters. Jed had not, in the small, careful 17 years between the small, careful summer of 1861 and the small, careful November of 1878, said the small, careful word, love, out loud, to any small, careful woman. By the small, careful November of 1878, Jed had begun to think the word once again. He had thought it the small, careful evening he had ridden down off the ridge for the small, careful order of 6-inch cut spring nails at the Pratt dry goods store, and had come back up the small, careful North Ridge Road at sundown, and had passed the small, careful town cabin at the south end of Main Street, and had, through the small, careful open front window of the town cabin, seen the small, careful widow Clementine Boone in her wine-red prairie dress and her clean white apron at her own careful iron stove with a small, careful blond boy of 3 at her small, careful side. Jed had not, at that small, careful evening in November of 1878, spoken to Clem. Jed had not spoken to her at any small, careful evening for the next 12 months. Jed had, on the small, careful 18th of November of 1879, ridden down off the ridge in the snow to ask her to come up and feed his own careful friend, old Tom Brennan. Jed had, by the small, careful arithmetic of the first 14 Fridays at the small back kitchen table of the Pratt boarding kitchen, since that November, begun to think the small, careful word he had last thought in the small, careful spring of 1861. By the small, careful 8th of May of 1880, at the small, careful corner of Main Street and the small, careful East Road, Jed had said the small, careful nearest sentence to the small, careful word that he had said to any woman since Ruth Elwood had married the small, careful lawyer Edwin Halloran of Philadelphia in the small, careful January of 1864. Jed had said, "Mr. Carver was wrong. You will name the small, careful Friday." Jed had said it plainly. Jed had said it slow. Jed had said it by his own careful count of 17 small, careful years of not saying it, on time. That was where Jed Stark came from. That was why he had walked into the Pratt dry goods store at 10:05 on that Saturday morning, without by any small, careful reading of any small, careful eye in that store, hesitating. The small, careful trouble with the small, careful 8th of May of 1880 was that Julius Carver of the Whitaker Boston Medical Company was not, by any small, careful count of that Saturday, the small, careful only new stranger in Bear Hollow, Montana territory. The small, careful other stranger had ridden in on the same small, careful 11 o'clock stage the day before. Her name was Mrs. Beatrice Kent. She was 47 years old. She was a small, careful widow from Butte City. She had inherited, from her own careful late husband, Mr. Randolph Kent, a small, careful sum of $9,200 in the small, careful spring of 1879. She had used the small, careful sum, in the small, careful autumn of the same year, to buy the small, careful two-story frame building at the small, careful north end of Main Street that had, for the 6 small, careful years before, been the small, careful mercantile of Mr. Fenton Boyd, who had died of the small, careful pneumonia in the small, careful January of 1880. Mrs. Beatrice Kent had spent the small, careful late winter and early spring of 1880 turning the small, careful mercantile building into a small, careful new boarding house. She had hired a small, careful crew of 3 carpenters out of Helena. She had ordered a small, careful set of 6 iron bedsteads and 12 wool mattresses out of Denver. She had ordered a small, careful new iron cook stove out of Chicago. She had ordered, by the small, careful 31st of April, 12 small, careful complete place settings of the small, careful anchor pattern white china out of Boston. She had, on the small, careful 6th of May of 1880, hung a small, careful painted wooden sign at the small, careful front of the building. The sign said, "Kent's Establishment, Rooms and Board, Home Cooking by Miss Portia Delacroix of New Orleans." Miss Portia Delacroix was 31. Miss Portia Delacroix had trained at the small, careful hotel dining rooms of New Orleans and St. Louis. Miss Portia Delacroix was 5'2" and 110 pounds, and had, by the small, careful arithmetic of every small, careful traveling salesman who had passed through Butte City in the small, careful last 5 years, a small, careful reputation for a small, careful thin waist, a small, careful sharp French tongue, and a small, careful low, steady dislike of any small, careful frontier cook who did not, by Miss Delacroix's own careful count, come out of a small, careful proper hotel kitchen. Kent's Establishment had opened for the small, careful business at 6:30 on the small, careful morning of the 7th of May. By noon on the 7th, Kent's Establishment had served the small, careful lunch to 3 small, careful boarders. All 3 had been small, careful men who had, until the 7th, been small, careful long-term boarders at the Pratt boarding kitchen. Their small, careful names were Mr. Vincent Hollis of the Bear Hollow Small, Careful Telegraph Office, Mr. Osborne Trilling of the Small, Careful Bear Hollow Assay Office, and Mr. Rutherford Peel of the Small, Careful Bear Hollow Bank. All 3 had, by the small, careful arithmetic of Miss Portia Delacroix's small, careful, sharp French tongue on the small, careful 6th of May, been personally called on. All 3 had been offered the small, careful, new small, careful rate of 30 cents a supper instead of the Pratt small, careful rate of 40. All 3 had said yes on the spot. That was the news Sarah Pratt had, at 6:30 on the small, careful morning of the 7th of May, delivered to Clem at the small, careful iron stove of the Pratt boarding kitchen. Sarah had said, "Lo, Clem, we have lost 3 boarders overnight. We will lose 2 more by the end of the small, careful week. Mrs. Beatrice Kent is a small, careful, serious woman. Miss Portia Delacroix is a small, careful, serious cook. The small, careful arithmetic of the Pratt boarding kitchen will not, by my own count, survive a small, careful loss of 5 boarders. Edmund and I have talked. We will need to cut the small, careful boarders' rate to 35 by Monday. We will need to cut your small, careful wage by $10 a month. I am, by my own count of 32 years of friendship, ashamed to have to say so." Clem had set her own careful wooden spoon down on the small, careful rim of the cast-iron skillet. Clem had said, "Sarah, you will not, in any month of the small, careful rest of my careful life, be ashamed to have to say so. The small, careful cut is the small, careful cut. I will take the small, careful cut. The boarding kitchen is my own careful home. Sarah had set her own careful hand, gentle, on Clem's own big, kind shoulder. That had been Friday morning. The small, careful Saturday morning at the Pratt dry goods store had come one day after. Now, on the small, careful Saturday afternoon, at 3 in the afternoon of the same 8th of May, Clem sat at her own careful small kitchen table at the town cabin at the south end of Main Street, with her own small Amos on her own careful right hand and Jed Stark on her own careful left. Jed had, by the small careful arithmetic of Amos's small careful cup of coffee invitation, been at the small careful kitchen table for the last 5 hours. Clem told him the small careful news of Kent's establishment. Clem told him of the 3 boarders. Clem told him of the $10 cut. Clem told him of the small careful arithmetic of the boarding kitchen through the summer. Jed listened. Jed said, "Lo, Clem, may I ride down the north end of Main Street this evening?" "For what small careful reason, Jed?" "For the small careful reason of the small careful supper at Kent's establishment. I would like to sit at the small careful new boarding house supper table. I would like to eat one small careful supper cooked by Miss Portia Delacroix. I would like to know, by my own careful arithmetic of one small careful evening, what the small careful competition at the small careful north end of Main Street is. I will pay the small careful 30 cents out of my own careful pocket. I will not, by any small careful count, tell any soul I am the small careful mountain man who has been at the small back kitchen table of the small careful Pratt boarding kitchen for the last 26 Fridays. I will come back to your careful kitchen table at 9 o'clock tonight. I will tell you what I have eaten. I will tell you what I think." Clem looked at Jed. Clem said, "Lo, Jed." "Yes, Jed. That is a small careful reconnaissance." "Clem, that is a small careful reconnaissance." "Jed, you were a small careful sharpshooter scout in the Army of the Potomac." "Clem, I was." "Jed, you have not, in your careful 9 winters on the North Ridge, done a small careful reconnaissance on any small careful frontier boarding house in Bear Hollow, Montana." "Clem, I have not. I will tonight." Clem set her own big careful hand, gentle, on Jed's own careful right hand at the kitchen table. Clem said, "Lo, Jed, ride down, sit at the small careful supper, come back at 9, bring your own careful list." Jed rode down to Kent's establishment at 6:30. Jed paid the small careful 30 cents. Jed sat at the small careful long boarding table with 7 small careful boarders. Jed ate a small careful plate of the small careful supper. The small careful supper was a small careful thin French bean soup, a small careful thin sliced roast beef with a small careful thin brown gravy, a small careful boiled potato, a small careful thin white bread with no butter, and a small careful thin slice of a small careful cake with a small careful thin white icing. Jed did not, in the small careful hour and 10 minutes of the small careful supper, speak a single word to Miss Portia Delacroix. Jed rode back to the town cabin at 9. Jed sat at Clem's own careful small kitchen table. Jed said, "Clem, the small careful supper was thin. The small careful French bean soup had, by my own count, no salt. The small careful roast beef was overcooked by 12 minutes. The small careful brown gravy was made of small careful cornstarch, not the small careful pan drippings. The small careful boiled potato was mealy. The small careful bread was store-bought. The small careful cake was 3 days old. Miss Portia Delacroix cooks a small careful thin supper of a small careful thin hotel arithmetic. The small careful supper will keep the small careful 3 boarders for the small careful first 2 weeks. It will not, by my own careful count of any small careful frontier man's own careful stomach, keep them past the small careful 3rd week. Your small careful boarders will come back. Sarah will not, by my own careful count, need to cut your small careful wage past the small careful 1st month." Clem set her own careful head, slow, in her own big careful hands. Clem said, "Lo, Jed, are you sure?" "Clem, I am." Clem laughed. It was the small, careful first laugh Amos, sitting on the small, careful rug by the iron stove, had heard from his own mama since the small, careful morning at the Pratt dry goods store. Clem said low, "Jed Stark." "Yes, Clem. Jed, you are a small, careful, thorough man." "Clem, I try." The small, careful, third careful conflict of the small, careful spring of 1880 was the small, careful cough of old Tom Brennan. Old Tom Brennan was 63 that spring. Old Tom Brennan had, by the small, careful arithmetic of the small, careful winter that had just ended, been at his own careful cabin, 2 miles below Jed's own ridge cabin, for the last 5 winters. Old Tom Brennan had been Jed Stark's own careful one friend in Bear Hollow for those 5 winters. Old Tom had lived, by Jed's own careful reading of a small, careful cough, that old Tom had brought back from the small, careful winter of 1878, on the small, careful edge of a small, careful chronic bronchitis for the last 2 careful winters. The small, careful cough was, by the small, careful spring of 1880, worse. On the small, careful Sunday morning of the 9th of May of 1880, one day after the small, careful Saturday morning at the Pratt dry goods store, Jed rode up the North Ridge Road at first light. Jed reached his own careful cabin at 7. Jed rode 2 miles further down to old Tom's own careful cabin at 7:30. Jed found old Tom at his own careful kitchen table with a small, careful cup of morning coffee in his own careful hands. Jed heard the small, careful cough old Tom Brennan had not, by Jed's own careful count of the last 6 Fridays, had at the small back kitchen table of the Pratt boarding kitchen. Jed sat down across from old Tom. Jed said, "Lo, Tom, that small, careful cough is worse." Old Tom Brennan said, small and dry, "Jed, it is." Jed said, "Tom, I will ride down for Clem this afternoon." Old Tom said, "Jed, I will not, by my own careful count of my own careful pride, have Clementine Boone ride up my careful ridge on a small, careful Sunday afternoon for the small, careful cough of a small, careful old freighter who has been small, careful too proud to ride down for the small, careful care of the small, careful cook of the Pratt boarding kitchen." Jed set his own careful cup of coffee, careful, on the small, careful pine table. Jed said, "Lo, Tom, that is the small, careful, longest sentence you have said to me in the last 4 months. I would, by my own count, like to say a small, careful, shorter sentence back to you. The sentence is, Clem will ride up this afternoon. You will not, by my own count, argue. You will let her look at the small, careful cough. You will let her set a small, careful poultice on your small, careful chest. You will let her stay for the small, careful supper. You will let her ride down at sundown. If you do not let her, Tom Brennan, I will not, on any small, careful Friday of any small, careful month ahead, ride down to the small back kitchen table for the small, careful 40-cent supper. I will not, on any small, careful Sunday of any small, careful month ahead, ride down for the small, careful coffee. I will, by my own count of the small, careful 9 winters we have shared the small, careful Friday coffee at your careful porch, sit at my own careful ridge cabin alone. Do you understand?" Old Tom Brennan looked at Jed for one long, careful second. Old Tom Brennan said, small and dry, "Jed, that is the small, careful, worst threat I have received in 63 careful years." Jed said, "Lo, Tom, it is. I will ride down for her at noon." Jed rode down for Clem at noon. Clem rode up at 2:30. Clem brought her own careful cast-iron skillet, her own careful medicine bag, her own careful small clay jar of dried mullein leaf, her own careful small clay jar of dried thyme, her own careful small clay jar of dried horehound, and her own careful small clay jar of honey. Clem set a small careful bread mustard poultice on old Tom's own careful chest at 3 in the afternoon. Clem brewed a small careful cup of mullein and thyme and horehound tea at 3:30. Clem fed old Tom the small careful cup of tea at 4. Clem heated a small careful bowl of chicken broth at 4:30 from the small careful bones she had brought up in the wicker basket. Clem fed old Tom the small careful broth at 5. Old Tom's small careful cough eased by 6. Old Tom said, At the small, careful supper Clem had cooked at his own careful iron stove at 6:30, one careful sentence Jed had not, in the small, careful 5 careful years of the Friday coffee at Tom's porch, heard the small, careful old freighter say. Old Tom said, "Lo, Miss Boone, I have not sat at a small, careful supper, cooked by any small, careful woman, at my own careful cabin, in 9 careful winters. I have not, in the same 9 careful winters, said a small, careful thank you to any small, careful woman, at any small, careful cabin. I would like to say a small, careful thank you now. I am, by my own careful arithmetic of my own careful bronchitis, obliged." Clem set her own careful spoon down on the small, careful rim of her own careful bowl. Clem said, "Lo, Tom Brennan." "Yes, Miss Boone. Tom, I will ride up every Sunday from now until the small, careful end of the small, careful spring. I will not, in any small, careful Sunday, take a small, careful coin. I will take the small, careful weekly gift of the small, careful 2 dozen fresh eggs from your own careful henhouse for the Pratt boarding kitchen. That will be my small, careful wage. Do you agree?" Old Tom Brennan said, low and dry, "Miss Boone, I agree." By the small, careful last Sunday of May, old Tom Brennan's small, careful cough was, by Clem's own careful reading of his own careful chest, at half of what it had been on the 9th. By the small, careful first Sunday of June, it was at a small, careful quarter. By the small, careful last Sunday of June, it was, by every careful account of anyone at the small, careful North Ridge, gone. The small, careful town of Bear Hollow, Montana, heard of Clem's small, careful Sunday, rides up the North Ridge Road by the small, careful second week of May. The small, careful town of Bear Hollow heard, by Camilla Bunting's own careful whisper at the small, careful Ladies' Aid Society on Tuesday the 11th, that the small, careful cook of the Pratt boarding kitchen was, by her own careful arithmetic, saving Jed Stark's own careful friend, old Tom Brennan, from a small, careful bronchitis Dr. Albert Hewitt had refused, at the small, careful 3rd of May, to ride out for. The small, careful town of Bear Hollow began, by the small, careful 3rd week of May, to shift. The small, careful shift was small. The small, careful shift was slow. The small, careful shift was the small, careful shift of a small, careful frontier town that had, in a small, careful 2 weeks, watched a small, careful traveling salesman get walked out of the small, careful dry goods store by a small, careful tall mountain man, had watched a small, careful new French boarding house lose 2 of its small, careful 3 boarders back to the Pratt kitchen by the small, careful 15th, had watched a small, careful widow ride up the small, careful North Ridge Road every small, careful Sunday to save a small, careful old freighter, and had begun to hear, from the small, careful lips of the small, careful 3, of the small, careful 7 women who had been at the counter of the Pratt dry goods store on the 8th, a small, careful version of the small, careful truth of what Julius Carver had said. By the small, careful last Sunday of May, 3 of the small, careful women had come to Sarah Pratt's own careful back door and had, in 3 careful separate visits, apologized to Sarah for not, on the small, careful morning of the 8th, saying a small, careful word. Sarah accepted the small, careful apologies. Sarah did not, by her own careful count, share them with Clem. By the small, careful first Sunday of June, the small, careful shift had reached the small, careful pulpit of the small, careful Methodist Church. The Reverend Tobias Marsh of the small, careful Methodist Church at the north end of Main Street of Bear Hollow, Montana Territory, was 59 years old in the spring of 1880. He was a small, round, warm Welshman. He had been at the small, careful pulpit of the small, careful Methodist Church since the small, careful autumn of 1876. He had married Daniel Boone and Clementine Boone in 1871 as a small, careful young circuit rider outside Kearney, Nebraska. He had buried Daniel Boone at the small, careful Bear Hollow Cemetery in the small, careful spring of 1879. The Reverend Marsh had, in the small, careful last week of May of 1880, ridden out to the North Settlement Road 3 separate careful times to visit 2 small, careful Norwegian families whose small, careful children had come down with a small, careful measles. He had, on those 3 careful rides, been ridden with by Clementine Boone, who had brought her own careful medicine bag and her own careful skillet and her own careful mullein tea. He had watched Clem work. He had watched Clem cook. He had watched Clem save 2 small, careful children the small, careful Dr. Albert Hewitt had refused, on the small, careful 3rd of May, to ride out for. On the small, careful first Sunday of June of 1880, the Reverend Tobias Marsh preached from the 16th chapter of the first book of Samuel, verse 7. He read the small, careful verse slow. He read the verse in the small, careful King James of the Bible he had carried in the small, careful field with the Union Army of the Cumberland for 4 small, careful years of the small, careful war. He read, "For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." The Reverend Marsh closed the small, careful Bible. The Reverend Marsh did not, in his own careful 30-minute sermon that Sunday morning, name Clementine Boone by name. The Reverend Marsh did not need to. The Reverend Marsh preached, slow and steady, on the small, careful subject of the small, careful outward appearance and the small, careful heart. He preached on the small, careful weakness of the small, careful eye that judges by the small, careful width of a shoulder or the small, careful size of a waist. He preached on the small, careful, stronger eye of the small, careful Lord who looks on the small, careful heart that had, in the small, careful last month, ridden up a small, careful North Ridge Road every small, careful Sunday to save a small, careful old freighter no doctor would ride out for. The Reverend Marsh, at the small, careful end of the small, careful sermon, looked at the small, careful back of the small, careful church. Clem was in the small, careful last pew on the left, where she had sat every Sunday since 1879. Jed Stark was in the pew behind her, where he had begun to sit on the small, careful 3rd Sunday of March that spring. Amos Miller was in the small pew beside Clem, holding a small, careful wooden horse in his own careful small hand. The Reverend Marsh did not, at that small, careful moment, need to say a small, careful word. But at the small, careful end of the small, careful service, when the small, careful last hymn had been sung, and the small, careful congregation had begun to stand up out of the small, careful pews, Jed Stark stood up first. Jed walked, slow and steady, up the small, careful center aisle of the small, careful Methodist church. Jed stopped, careful, at the front of the small, careful altar. Jed turned. Jed faced the small, careful congregation. The small, careful church went silent. Jed said, in his low, careful voice, "Reverend, may I say a small, careful word?" The Reverend Tobias Marsh smiled the small, careful Welsh smile that had been his own careful weapon in the small, careful pulpit for the last 4 careful years. The Reverend said, "Mr. Stark, say it." Jed took his own careful hat off his own careful head. Jed held the hat in his own careful right hand. Jed spoke to the whole congregation of the small, careful Methodist Church of Bear Hollow, Montana, on the small, careful first Sunday of June of 1880, in the same low, careful voice he had used, on the small, careful Saturday morning of the 8th of May, to Julius Carver of the Whitaker Boston Medical Company. "Folks of Bear Hollow, my name is Jedediah Stark. I have been on the North Ridge above this valley for the last 9 winters. I have not, in those 9 winters, spoken from any small, careful pulpit. I will speak now." He paused. He looked at Clem in the last pew. He went on. On the small, careful Saturday morning of the 8th of May, a small, careful traveling salesman by the name of Julius Carver stood at the small, careful counter of the Pratt dry goods store and said a small, careful, cruel sentence about the small, careful widow Clementine Boone in the small, careful hearing of 7 other women of this town. The small, careful sentence was that Clem was too big to love. The small, careful sentence was, by the careful reading of every man in this church who has any small, careful arithmetic of his own careful heart, wrong. I told Julius Carver so at the small, careful counter. Julius Carver walked out of this town on the noon stage. He will not, by my own careful count, come back. That was the small, careful public correction of the small, careful salesman. He paused again. He looked, slow, at Camilla Bunting in the small, careful third pew on the right side. He said, "I would like to say the small, careful public correction of the small, careful town this morning as well. Folks, there has been a small, careful whisper in the small, careful kitchens of this town for the last 6 months, and for the last 5 years, and for the small, careful last 7 years, that the small, careful cook of the Pratt boarding kitchen is a small, careful widow whose own careful frame is a small, careful obstacle to the small, careful state of matrimony. The whisper was, by any small, careful reading of any small, careful heart in this church, wrong." He paused. He said low, "I would like to say the whisper wrong out loud now." He turned. He faced Clem in the small, careful last pew. He said, in the same low, careful voice, "Clementine Boone, I am not, on this small, careful Sunday morning, going to ask you the small, careful question I said I would ask you at a small, careful Friday supper of your own careful naming. I would like to say, in front of the whole small, careful town of Bear Hollow, that the small, careful question is coming. The small, careful question is coming, because you are, by any small, careful reading of my own careful heart of the last 6 months, the finest careful woman I have ever sat across a small, careful kitchen table from, in my own careful 42 years of life. You are the biggest, kindest, bravest widow this valley has. You are, by my own count of any small, careful arithmetic, the small, careful heart on which the small, careful Lord looks. I would like the small, careful town of Bear Hollow to know so." He paused. He said, "The small, careful question is coming, Clem. You will name the Friday." He set his hat back on his own careful head. He walked, slow and steady, back down the small, careful center aisle of the small, careful Methodist church. He sat back down in the small, careful second-to-last pew. The small, careful congregation of the small, careful Methodist church did not, for one long, careful second, breathe. Then Sarah Pratt, in the small, careful fourth pew on the left, began to clap. Then Edmund Pratt, beside her, began to clap. Then Hiram Foley of the freight depot in the small, careful fifth pew began to clap. Then the 4 Miller cousins of Amos's own careful father Hans, who had come in from the small, careful North Settlement Road that Sunday morning to sit in the small, careful 6th pew, began to clap. By the small, careful count of the small, careful 12th second, the whole church was on its feet. Camilla Bunting, in the small, careful 3rd pew on the right, did not, at first, stand. Then she did. Clem, in the last pew on the left, sat very still for one long, careful second. Then she stood up. She turned to Jed in the small, careful pew behind her. She said, quiet enough that only the small, careful 2 of them heard, "Jed, this Friday, the 14th. Jed nodded. The small, careful question came at the small back kitchen table of the Pratt boarding kitchen at 7:10 on the small, careful Friday evening of the 14th of June of 1880. Jed Stark had ridden down off the ridge at 4 in the afternoon. Jed had bought a small, careful bunch of the small, careful first roses of the summer from the small, careful garden of Mrs. Lottie Marsh, the schoolmistress and Reverend's wife, on his ride past the small, careful parsonage at 5. Jed had brought the small, careful roses in his own careful gloved hand. Jed had set the small, careful roses, careful, on the small back kitchen table before the small, careful supper had been served. The small, careful supper was a small, careful roast pork with a small, careful pan gravy. Small, careful biscuits Clem had baked at 3. A small, careful bowl of the small, careful new spring peas from Sarah Pratt's own careful garden, and a small, careful slice of a rhubarb pie Clem had made that morning from the small, careful rhubarb Hiram Foley had brought over from his own careful patch on Wednesday. Amos ate first. Old Tom Brennan, who had ridden down for the small, careful Friday supper for the first time in 4 weeks, ate second. Jed ate third. Clem ate last, standing at the small, careful iron stove, the way she had always eaten on Friday nights at the boarding kitchen for the last 7 years. At 7:10, Jed set his own careful fork down. Jed said, "Lo, Clem." Clem, at the iron stove, said, "Jed." Jed said, "Clem, I have carried your own mother Rebecca Stark's small, careful wedding band in my own careful breast pocket for the last 5 weeks. I have not in any small, careful minute of any small, careful day taken it out. I would like to take it out now. Will you sit down at the small, careful kitchen table with me?" Clem set her own careful wooden spoon down on the small, careful rim of the cast-iron skillet, with the small SWO carved in the handle. Clem walked, slow and steady, the small, careful 4 steps to her own small, careful chair at the small back kitchen table. Clem sat down. Jed took the small, careful ring, careful, out of his own breast pocket. Jed set the small, careful ring on the small, worn wood of the table between them. Jed did not, at that small, careful moment, kneel. Jed sat across from his own careful, big, kind widow of 35 careful years. Jed put his own big, careful hand, gentle, on top of Clem's own big, careful right hand. Jed said, "Lo, Clementine Boone, will you marry me? Not because Mr. Carver was wrong, not because Camilla Bunting was wrong, not because the small, careful Reverend Marsh preached the small, careful right verse on the small, careful first Sunday of June, because I would, by my own careful count of 6 months of Fridays and 1 careful November 18 months back, be honored to sit across the small, careful kitchen table from you for the small, careful rest of the life I have left." Clem did not, for 1 long, careful second, breathe. Then she said, low and steady, "Jed Stark, I will." Amos Miller, at the small, careful chair across the kitchen, said in his small, quiet voice, "Mr. Stark, Amos, Mr. Stark, may I now call you Papa Jed?" Jed did not, at that small, careful moment, let go of Clem's own careful right hand. Jed looked, slow, at Amos in his own careful chair. Jed said, in a voice old Tom Brennan had not, in 5 careful years of the Friday coffee, heard the tall, quiet mountain man of 42 use. "Amos Miller, you may." Old Tom Brennan, at his own careful chair beside Amos, set his own careful old head, slow, in his own careful hands, and did not, for 1 long careful second, take them away. The wedding was set for the small careful last Saturday of June of 1880. The small careful last Saturday of June was the 26th. I will tell you one more thing. The small, careful blue tin of Dr. Whittaker's reducing salts that had rolled under the small, careful counter of the Pratt dry goods store on the small, careful morning of the 8th of May was found, 3 months later, by Edmund Pratt's own careful stable boy while sweeping the store on the small, careful last Friday of August. The stable boy brought the small tin to Edmund. Edmund brought the small tin to Sarah at the boarding kitchen. Sarah brought the small tin to Clem at the iron stove. Clem took the small tin, careful, in her own big, kind hand. Clem opened the small tin. Clem tipped the small, careful pale blue powder into the small, careful ash bucket at the side of the iron stove. Clem closed the small tin. Clem set the small tin, empty, on the small, careful shelf above the iron stove of the town cabin at the south end of Main Street, beside the small carved oak box that held the wedding bands of Sarah Boone and Daniel Boone, and, since the small, careful Sunday morning of the 27th of June of 1880, the small, careful wedding band of Jedediah Stark's own careful mother, Rebecca Stark of Lawrence County, Pennsylvania. The small tin stayed on the small, careful shelf for the small, careful rest of Clem's own careful life. Clem did not ever say why. She did not need to. Clementine Boone Stark of Bear Hollow, Montana, was a size 24 when she married Jed Stark in the small, careful Methodist church on the 26th of June of 1880. She was a size 24 every day of the 29 careful years of the marriage that followed. She died in the autumn of 1909 of a small, quiet stroke at her own careful kitchen table at the town cabin. She was a size 24 the morning she died. She had, by every small, careful account of every small, careful person who had ever sat at a small, careful kitchen table with her, been loved every single one of those careful days. That is the end of the story.